is, I believe it's your job to assess where he lies on the continuum.
Good way to look at it.
It'll actually start affecting other sites of the spinal cord that's not associated with tissue damage.
But we're trying to understand, how the body works as a body, not just as a system of the body.
We're on. We are live with the Oreo. Don't know that hat. What hat is that?
It's a fishing hat.
The fishing hat? What's SA?
I don't know. It's a fishing brand.
Fishing shield?
It's a shield.
So, what are we doing? What are we talking about?
Today we're talking about breath, breathing, energy systems. That's what they want to hear.
That's what the kids want to hear. As a little introduction is just the concept of adapting versus optimizing, which something that we got from Andy Galpin, and he's an exercise physiologist or bioenergetics, human bioenergetics from Cal State Fullerton. He teaches there. He has his PhD in that. But that concept of adapting, you're either going to be adapting in some way to something, or you're going to be optimizing in that thing. So essentially, adapting is the concept of taking one step back to take two steps forward with your body, with your physiology, with any part of your body that can adapt, strength, what have you. And that two steps forward part of it is the optimizing piece. So you need a balance between those two if you're going to have any type of growth. And if you continuously stress the system, so only taking steps backwards, for instance, without that optimization piece, as you can see, you will regress. So if I'm in the gym and I am constantly doing bicep curls, and I'm doing bicep curls throughout the day, and I do them every single day, and my bicep has no chance to rest, I'm going to continuously have muscle breakdown or whatever it is, neuromuscular fatigue, any part of that muscle hypertrophy, the mechanisms of muscle hypertrophy, so all three of them. If I'm doing them too much, I'm going to have too much adaptation and I'll go backwards. But if I continuously rest my bicep throughout the years, you see this in a lot of people who are sedentary. They continuously don't adapt and they're continuously optimizing. So at first, if you work out, then you optimize for the next day or 2 days, whatever you're talking about, all right, you'll get better, you'll improve at first. But then if you continuously optimize after that for the next 5 years, you will regress in that thing. And that's pretty obvious, but it's something that you have to always keep in the back of your head.
If you're content at where you are in whatever situation you're at, you're never going to grow from that. And that's a principle for a lot of things.
Yeah.
With that adaptation piece in mind, before we get into the actual breathing and aerobic respiration, I want to talk about a little bit about the ANS, the autonomic nervous system. A lot of times people are mostly in a sympathetic state, which we'll get into, and that could be a downfall because you need balance within the two. So like humans can learn how to shift into a more parasympathetic tone. The wild animals tend to do this better than humans. If you think about a lion stalking an antelope or a gazelle, whatever it is, they are in a sympathetic state as they're stalking, right? They're calm, they're cool, they're going very slowly, and then they can switch into that sympathetic real quick to go attack their prey. And then once they're done, they switch back. Fortunately, humans don't really get to that point because of everything going on in society and all the challenges of life. So, for example, someone with road rage most likely is going to stay angry the whole ride after even they got into a scuffle with whatever the minor argument was on the road. Probably they're going to get to their destination, they're going to continue to dwell upon it, they're going to tell others what happened, they're going to keep their heart rate up. Every time we think about it, they're going to switch into that sympathetic tone, which means, and as we'll get to, this means you're in more of an anaerobic energy system. So the sympathetic tone triggers the anaerobic energy system, and the parasympathetic tone triggers more of the aerobic energy system. So you're going to be more in an anaerobic energy system utilization, which means you're not in the aerobic energy system most of the time, so you lack the development of the aerobic energy system, which means you have less CO2 produced, because CO2 is a byproduct of aerobic respiration, which means you have poor CO2 tolerance, and we'll get to that, but essentially you're in a chronic downhill slide of high sympathetic tone. So going back to balancing, you're not balanced. You're constantly in a sympathetic tone.
Yeah, I think some examples of this when it comes to breathing. So if we could just tie in the breathing a little bit to the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. So if you look at something like COPD, yeah, it's primarily like statistically, it's not caused by a high sympathetic tone. It's caused primarily by smoking, and smoking is going to cause decrease elasticity. So it's going to be more difficult for you to breathe because your lungs become so they become so extended. So you're in that constant breathing in all the way, and your lungs become whatever that word is, and you can't breathe out as much either. Obviously, so that will lead to something like hypercapnia. So that's COPD. So you can't breathe as well out. That breath, so that stress, bringing it back, that stress with that recovery. So you're just adapting technically. You're adapting without the recovery. If I were to take Angela or me and I put them in a state where we had to pretend like we had COPD and we had to breathe that way, and we did it purposefully, and we knew what we were trying to target physiologically, we did it for a period and then we rested after, we would get some physiological adaptations that we'll talk about. But these people that have COPD have no choice but to continuously be in it. So that's like the person that's doing a bicep curl all day every day without any rest, but they just have no choice. But then on the flip side, so that's hypercapnia. They have a lot of CO2. Their blood is very acidic, it's low, their pH. And on the other side though, you could be too parasympathetic. So this is someone that never stresses their aerobic system at all, for example, and they're just in a state of recovery. And their system might become basic over time, like very basic, their pH. This is, for example, say I took purposeful breaths that decrease the amount of CO2 all day long. I'm just not building up CO2 within the system. So what ends up happening is that my tolerance for CO2 is going to go down. So you want to go into that aerobic respiration now? A little bit into it?
Yeah, so just pretty much go through the phys of it real quick and the reactions that take place. So the aerobic respiration, the aerobic energy system is the most efficient energy system of the human organism. It's essentially you're using 1 molecule of glucose and 6 molecules of oxygen, or O2, to yield 6 CO2s, which is a byproduct, 6 water molecules, and also 38 ATPs, which is the energy form of energy for the human body. So from 1 glucose, you get 38 ATPs, as opposed to something like glycolysis strictly, which would be pretty much you just be getting 2 ATPs from it. So it's
Per pyruvate.
yeah. So yeah. So
4.
so 4. So the reactions that lead to the aerobic respiration can pretty much be broken down to 4 steps. You have, like I said, the glycolysis, which is the actual breaking of the glucose or the sugar molecule into the pyruvate molecules. So you're pretty much just cutting it in half, and now you have 2 pyruvate molecules, and this yields 2 ATP molecules. So per pyruvate. It also, in glycolysis, it turns something called NAD plus into NADH. So it pretty much just takes a hydrogen onto it, which is, you can also see that as just another electron. So this plays a key role in the mitochondria's electron transport chain for down the road in this aerobic respiration. So for future formation of ATP. The second step is the oxidative decarboxylation of pyruvate. So this is when pyruvate is brought to the mitochondria, and it's joined with something called coenzyme A. and this releases a CO2 molecule and forms acetyl-CoA. So acetyl-CoA is important for the next step, and also in this part, more NADH is produced. So in the next step, citric acid cycle, there's a bunch of chemical reactions that take place in the mitochondria. Now the initial glucose molecule was split into two pyruvates, right? So then it was turned into acetyl-CoA. Now that acetyl-CoA enters the citric acid cycle. So in other words, the two carbon molecules enter the citric acid cycle in the form of acetyl-CoA. The citric acid cycle basically yields two CO2 molecules, three NADH molecules, one FADH, and one ATP. So don't have to get too crazy about all those words and crazy molecules. Just know that it's pretty much building on itself to get to the fourth step, which is oxidative phosphorylation. This is where a lot of the energy is made. The NADH and the FADH that was produced in the previous steps are now able to donate that electron that they got, or that hydrogen that they got, to the electron transport chain in the mitochondria. So this is taking place in the mitochondria now. These electrons are then passed from higher to lower energy levels. This produces a lot of energy, which powers a proton pump and ultimately pushes the formation of ATP. So this is where oxygen comes into play. Oxygen is needed to be available at the end of this electron transport chain so that it can accept the electrons and so that they don't go back up the chain. And this will pretty much reverse the production of ATP, and you won't have the yield of ATP. So basically, oxygen is needed to complete and continue the process of ATP production. And again, it's going to yield 36 ATP molecules, which is by far the most out of any other energy system, whether it's the glycolysis or the PCR system. You want to go into CO2 tolerance?
Yeah. So basically, just to go back, we talked about adapting versus optimizing, and how that relates to stress and the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system, and how breathing is tied in with that. So, and then we just broke down how that energy is made from that oxygen. And I think the most important points to look at that is how involved it is, and how glucose is involved in this. So within aerobic respiration, it depends on where you are in this whole cycle. So if you're very low aerobically and you're just doing day-to-day activities, you could be not be using glycolysis at all. You could be just jumping right to that acetyl-CoA and taking it from free fatty acids.
Beta oxidation, yeah.
Yeah, beta oxidation, which is what you should be going through when you're very low, when you're low aerobic, or even mildly aerobic, you have some level of activity. But then when you start getting towards your anaerobic threshold, where you have too much acid or too much CO2 that you cannot continue further, because your oxygen availability, because of CO2, we'll get into it, is not going to be high enough to meet the energy demands quick enough. It'll be efficient, but it's not quick enough. Then you're going to have to switch over and start using glycolysis. But glycolysis is definitely, it's backwards. You don't switch. It's not three different energy systems working at different times. They're all kind of working together. But your ability to stay primarily aerobic is what we're going to be getting into this. So if you go past the demands where you're going to not be able to use aerobic energy, which is the oxidative decarboxylation of pyruvate and on through the citric acid cycle and oxidative phosphorylation, then you're gonna then there's problems, because if there's too much glycolytic activity happening, we'll get into it. So what I just mentioned about CO2 tolerance, once the tolerance that your body has to CO2, once it's reached the threshold, that reaching of the threshold is telling you have to start breathing faster. Everything has to, and I kind of just made this connection recently, everything has to, when things happen faster, they happen less efficiently. So there's a drawback. You want to try and stay as efficient as possible for as long as possible. So this can mean metabolically. Aerobic is more efficient but slower than glycolysis. Breathing wise, breathing mechanics. The diaphragm will allow you to get more perfusion of air, so it's more efficient. You'll have a better ventilation process happening. You'll get more oxygen in, but it's slower than breathing through your mouth. Than breathing with your upper respiratory muscles. It's probably could be quicker. And there's a lot of different things. Heart rate and stroke volume. As your heart rate increases, if it increases too much, that's going to come at a price of your total cardiac output or your stroke volume. So that's like a common theme that I kind of noticed. So CO2 tolerance, once you've reached your CO2 tolerance, you have to switch over to a faster energy system to get rid of that CO2. And I think that, yes, the oxygen is the thing that's giving you the energy, but there's usually enough oxygen. You have enough oxygen that you could potentially breathe in to meet the demands. A lot of the times, I think the problem is the tolerance to the CO2, and that's what the literature says. So when people talk about things like VO2 max, there's a lot that goes into VO2 max, but I think another way that you could look at VO2 max is looking at your tolerance to CO2. But if we just look at the lungs real quick, so your ability to inhale O2 and exhale CO2. So when you inhale oxygen, if you inhale oxygen, what happens? You inhale oxygen, the oxygen goes to your alveoli, gas exchange occurs, and the CO2 kicks off. The CO2 comes off of the red blood cell, and oxygen gets tacked on, and that's the Bohr effect. So the more CO2 that you have, the more oxygen that can be binded onto that hemoglobin. So if you don't have that CO2 that's binded there, if you can't tolerate a high level of CO2, you won't be able to get that oxygen to even bind on there. So that's one thing. So that's one example of like that gas exchange part. So so that's why it's really important. So you have to be able to tolerate that CO2, and that's one adaptation for this VO2 max or CO2 tolerance. Another example though is like if you don't have enough blood to even carry CO2, say you're below your CO2 tolerance, but you've maxed out the amount of carbon dioxide that you're carrying, so you never even reach your CO2 tolerance, then that's going to be your limiting factor, is the fact that you don't have enough hemoglobin, red blood cells, whatever. And it's important to specify the different parts of VO2 max or the different parts of endurance, because they could all be trainable if you are smart about it. So just like a little insight to that would be, if you do breath holds with your air out, essentially what's happening physiologically is your CO2 is building up. Therefore, and your CO2 is building up in your blood, and you're not getting a lot of oxygen in. So what's going to end up happening is your body's going to get a signal to not only that your CO2 is rising like crazy within your blood because you're not getting any gas exchange into your lungs and out, but also that you need more blood. So your body's going to say, get more blood. And that's proven in the literature. Like your spleen will contract and you'll get more hemoglobin, more red blood cells, which is like crazy. But these are the things that I feel like a lot of people don't think about, is what are the specific adaptations I need for my specific problems, and how do I achieve those adaptations? And that's the way that I think, that I like to think the most. Yeah. So if you're doing a lot of work, right? I'm sprinting, or I'm running, and I'm breathing, and I'm doing it all through my nose, right? I'm just breathing in and out of my nose. I'm not getting a ton of oxygen in, or I'm not getting oxygen in quickly, or I'm not expelling CO2 quickly. I'm breathing pretty controlled just through my nose. What's going to end up happening is I'm going to get the best, or probably a more efficient perfusion rate or gas exchange of oxygen, because I'm breathing at a more efficient ventilation. So if I start breathing faster and I start breathing through my mouth, then what ends up happening is I'm I'm trying to I'm working less efficiently for the acute problem of too much CO2. So I'm trying to blow all that CO2 out. And if you're doing this in the absence of exercise, which a lot of people do subconsciously, is they'll just breathe through their mouth. What are you doing? You're just getting rid of all your CO2. If you're doing this with exercise, same thing. You're just getting rid of all your CO2 quickly. And what ends up happening is you're not building that aerobic system like you think you are, because in order to build that aerobic system, improve your VO2 max, you have to improve your CO2 tolerance. That's a huge part of it. That's a huge part of the VO2 max. The mechanics of your VO2 max is improving your CO2 tolerance. And so you have to let it build. So yes, in the short term, if I go for a run and I just breathe through my nose, but my whole life I breathe through my mouth, I will have to slow down. Why? My body is so much ahead. So my muscle, the endurance of my muscles are so far ahead of my more central VO2 max, the central parts of my VO2 max, like my lungs and my heart, because I'm not training them. I'm training my muscles and my muscle endurance, not training my cardiovascular as much, or my my CO2 tolerance as much. So that's a problem, because that's your sink. That's pretty much your sink. And if you don't train that, then um, not only will your performance decay, your performance won't be as great, which we'll get into, but also your just day to day, your recovery, your everything, your ability to get into a parasympathetic state decreases greatly. So it's important to understand what you're training for, I think, is the big point I'm trying to get to.
Yeah, and just to reiterate, I think something that not a lot of people realize is, like you said, the Bohr effect. So when you, let's say you're doing a lot of work and you produce a lot of CO2 through aerobic respiration or whatever you're doing, and as that, so let's say you're just breathing nasally, so you're not going in so much into that sympathetic tone, you're staying as parasympathetic as you are, you're going nasally in through your nose, out through your nose, so the air is going slower through, you're not getting as much CO2 out, like you were saying. And I think something that people don't realize is when you have CO2 sticking around on your red blood cells, that means that it's kicking off the oxygen, which is now making it more available to use. So that's something that I don't think a lot of people think about, is they just, like you're saying, they breathe heavy, and they're not thinking about why they're breathing heavy, or maybe a downfall of breathing heavy, especially like when you're training. If there's something, if you're training for aerobic capacity, I think something to implement is definitely just nasal breathing that whole time. And if you get past that point where you can't nasal breathe, then honestly you're not training your aerobic capacity anymore. You're training other energy systems.
I think a good thing to go back to is adapting versus optimizing. So, for people that are into lifting or whatever, a good analogy that I made up is, if you're going to take a new lifter that's never deadlifted before, how are they going to probably deadlift if they don't have good hip extension strength? They're going to use their lumbar, they're going to get a lot of lumbar flexion torque, and they're going to try and just extend their lumbar a lot more. If you try and make them use hip extension, which one are they going to move more weight with? Probably right now, the lumbar extension, because
Right.
that's what they're stronger in. Does that mean that's the way that they should lift? No. Because why? Because it has a ceiling performance-wise, because it's not as much advantageous musculature that's going to move that weight, and it also can be a risk for injury. But they kind of go hand in hand, because it's not the most efficient. It's not as efficient as using your hip musculature for it. Same thing with aerobic. If I have you run right now, and you've never breathed in and out of your nose ever, or even at least during exercise, you're going to go way slower. You're going to have to go slower in and out of your nose, because you've never done it before. Does that mean, though, it's not the best thing for adaptation? Maybe it's best if you had a game tomorrow and you had to perform really high. All right, do what you've always done. But if you're in a period where you're trying to get a specific adaptation, that's what you should do, in and out of your nose. But then it also has performance benefits to it. But if you've never done it, then maybe it's not something you should do performance-wise.
Yeah. And so nasal breathing, I think, is what we're getting at here for aerobic energy system development. And there's plenty of reasons why nasal breathing is important. Like it's one, it optimizes the oxygen delivery, like what we were just saying, the Bohr effect. And it also, the literature also shows that nitric oxide levels increase with nasal breathing. And there's some research that shows it increases up to 15% or 15 times, I'm sorry. So what does that mean? So nitric oxide is a vasodilator, which allows us to deliver more oxygen into the blood quicker. So everything is, so now that your vessels are dilated more blood can go through, and that's another way to increase your VO2 max, is be more efficient with your VO2 max. Another thing is that when you breathe through your nose, you're warming and humidifying the air, which is something that doesn't happen in mouth breathing. And your lungs work better at down to the point of gas exchange in your lungs. It works better when the air is warm and humidified, which is also another benefit of nasal breathing. And there's a lot more to it.
Yeah, and then on the CO2 side of nasal breathing, so a lot of times you'll have plenty of oxygen, but if your CO2 becomes so high that you're setting off either the peripheral or central chemoreceptors that are telling you to breathe, or your mechanics of breathing aren't appropriate to handle that CO2, those breaths. So that causes an inhalation. So those peripheral, so before I go into those, so that reflexive inhalation, yes, you're bringing in more oxygen, but when you're really tired and you really feel like you need to breathe more, it's not for the purpose of oxygen. You can use anaerobic energy. It's not in that high of a demand. Like there's plenty of oxygen. Like you'll get through. The nervousness of having to take that breath is so you can get oxygen in, so gas exchange occurs to get CO2 out of your blood. That's what's happening. So that reflexive inhalation, when you like hold your breath or you're underwater, you're holding your breath and you have to come up for air, that's CO2 tolerance. So that is something to keep in mind too. So when you're breathing through your nose, what's happening? So it doesn't allow you to get as much oxygen to enter the lungs as fast as mouth breathing. So this causes an adaptation. So you're not getting as much oxygen in fast, so you have less CO2 transfer. So there's more CO2 that's staying in your blood. The acidity of your blood is staying lower. That tolerance is going to get improved over time. If you kept breathing out of your mouth, then that tolerance, not only will it stop getting more tolerant, you'll actually decrease, optimizing too long. When you have suffocation, if somebody's putting a pillow over your face or you're underwater, somebody's pushing you underwater, you get scared, you get anxious. What's happening? Your CO2, those chemoreceptors are going off. Like there's high amounts of CO2 that you can't handle. You're going to die without oxygen. So it's pretty natural that you would have some type of anxiety with the associated CO2. So when you start to mouth breathe, especially when you're anxious, which a lot of people are anxious a lot, then essentially you're just trying to get rid of the CO2 and shift into glycolysis, because you're trying to get rid of as much CO2 as possible because you have no tolerance to it. So you're shifting to glycolysis, and this is a more sympathetic system that you're using. So your heart rate's going to increase, your respiratory rate, and you start to mainly use glucose as fuel. So metabolically, you're not even geared to use fat as fuel. So that's a whole nother topic, but it could be a possible link that makes sense physiologically, is that a lot of people maintain a lot of fat is because they are very sympathetic. They're using glucose as fuel. They have a lot of cortisol, which is going to help you maintain a lot of fat. So there's a lot of links here. Also, there's links to body kinetics. So So if you're going to be using your accessory respiratory muscles for ventilation, then all right, your diaphragm's not working. So those accessory muscles are going to, like your upper trap, those are going to be really on all the time. So what's going to happen? Your head is going to go forward. All those postural abnormalities that you talk about in physical therapy school will happen. What else will happen? Your psoas won't function as it should. So it'll become a weaker muscle, whatever, what have you, because your diaphragm isn't functioning properly. So if your diaphragm doesn't descend down to open up the lower lobes of your lungs, your psoas attaches to your diaphragm through fascia and pretty directly if you look at it. And it's going to tighten up that end of the psoas. So that end of the psoas is going to be tight. And your psoas is attaches to your spine, and it could cause problems with low back pain. It could cause anything. It could cause problems just with your mechanics overall that leads to pain.
Yeah, and I think that's something. I mean, you just went from from breathing to breathing like physiology to breathing mechanics to how your faulty breathing mechanics through prolonged stress and chronic stress states could result in your psoas being tight or weak. And a lot of people would just assume that you have to just stretch your hip flexors, and that's, that's there's a place for it, but I think it's optimal to look at this as well, and in terms of treatment and all that. But that's not for this episode.
Yeah, I
And
agree.
so I guess just implementing like certain strategies for certain periods of training, I guess you could say, is there's so Brian McKenzie, who's at the forefront of a lot of this breathing stuff. Him and his team developed what's called the gears. So if there's 5 gears, and whatever gear you're in is pretty much whatever energy system you're training. So it's just an easy way to kind of see where you are in terms of energy system. So gear 1 is you breathe in and out equally. So you're in and out equally. So that's like a low aerobic energy usage, right? You're anaerobic, but it's like very mild aerobic. Gear 2 is you're breathing fast in and slow out all through the nose. So that's you're getting to that higher aerobic capacity, if you will. Gear 3 is you're breathing fast in and fast out through your mouth, or through your nose, I'm sorry. And this is just about your anaerobic threshold. So anything beyond this, you'd be in an anaerobic energy system, which is.
And just tying that back in. So it's a good indicator, it's a good cue, and it's a good time to understand the feeling of
Right.
your body and how you feel when you're about to switch from like that's a big part of it too, is the understanding of when you're about to switch from primarily being aerobic to anaerobic. When you have to start breathing through your mouth, why is that the indicator? It's the indicator because you have to get more oxygen in, either more oxygen in through your mouth quicker to get more CO2 out quicker, or breathe out quicker through your mouth so that you can take your next inhalation quicker. So that's the reason. It's not just a magic switch that, no, there's a physiological reason. It's linked to CO2 tolerance.
Yes, it's pretty much all about CO2. But so gear 4 is nasal in and mouth out. So that's low anaerobic. And then gear 5 is mouth in, mouth out. So that's your higher anaerobic. That's pretty intense work. So that's just something that you can utilize for training.
And there's a couple ways that you can look at that you can measure it. So one way through Brian McKenzie the way that he measures it is through like a CO2 tolerance test, where you could just type in his name on Google and look at his CO2 tolerance test. But it just essentially you're taking a big breath in and you're seeing how long you can expel it for without stopping at any point. And he has different metrics that he says, all right, you're in a good zone here, whatever. It's just a good baseline and to see how well you can improve. There's another called the BOLT score, which we got from Cal Dietz, which is a strength coach for the University of Minnesota. And I think he got it from somewhere else. It may have been the book Oxygen Advantage or something like that. But that is a little bit different where he's having you breathe all your air out, all your air is going out, and then you hold with all of your air out and see how long you could tolerate that. And it shouldn't be crazy like you're squirming and you're struggling. It should be like, all right, I got to breathe now. And you take that breath. So that's the BOLT score. But the reason I think I like the CO2 tolerance test a little bit better because it kind of tests everything. It tests not only your chemoreceptors, your ability to actually tolerate the CO2, but also your ventilatory mechanics. So how well you can control your diaphragm when you breathe. And I also like both of these tests because when you separate them from exercise, people with exercise, I could have two people with the same VO2 max, same CO2 tolerance, but one and they're running at the same exact speed, say, and they have the same endurance, whatever, but one is better, one is going to be more efficient, maybe because his tendons are giving him free energy, or his muscle spindles giving him free energy. So these kind of eliminate all of those variables and say, what is this specific physiological limiter that, like, what is the measurement of it? So that's why I like it. So if you're testing somebody's VO2 max and you're hooking them up with heart rate and all these things, and they're on a treadmill running, and you're looking at the partial pressure of oxygen and carbon dioxide, I feel like there's a lot of limiters to that. There could be a lot of limiters, but it's still definitely a good thing to test. But I think that this is just a different way, a different test that you can do.
Yeah. And I think another important thing to take away is it's important to switch, to know how to switch and know the feeling of when to switch from sympathetic to parasympathetic, or I guess you can also say anaerobic to aerobic. They're pretty synonymous in terms of this, but and so you take like a basketball player, for example, if it's like the first quarter and you notice that their hands are on their knees and they're breathing through their mouth, that they're already in this sympathetic state. And what we know is that your performance, it's going to be heightened for a small period of time. But if this is happening in like the first quarter, for example, that performance is not going to be able to be sustainable for the whole fourth quarter.
And a couple things on that. It's you're athletically, you might have more ability to do things, but you might not be in as much control as you could be also. So that's one thing. And yeah, you won't be able to sustain it. But another thing that I've noticed just watching these NBA games is some of these young guys that are thrown into the fire that are scared. And I realized this myself when I was a freshman in college, or when I was a sophomore playing in high school, that that if I got nervous playing, if I was nervous, what would I do? I would go in the game and I'd put my hands on my knees immediately, right when I got in. Was I tired? No. But what was going on is I was shifting and I was breathing through my mouth. I was nervous. I was shifting to a more sympathetic state. My heart rate was increasing regardless of exercise. I was just nervous. So that nervousness is shifting me into a sympathetic state. I'm using glycolysis. I'm already going to get tired so much faster. Now that I know that, I play and I feel the difference. If I'm in practice, when I was in practice, when I was younger, in my younger stages, I'm in practice and I feel so much more in shape, but I'm not really in shape. I'm just using my metabolism way smarter. I'm being way smarter about it, and anybody can do that. That you just have to be attentive to it.
Yeah, you're pretty much staying. There's no need to get nervous in practice because it's practice. It's not a game. And something, another thing is there are points in the game where you should know to, what's up, Didi? Where you should know when it's important to kind of switch through that anaerobic system for a short period of time. So, for example, at the end of a game or at the end of the half or something, if there's a minute left in the game or the half, you start breathing through your mouth, and yeah, okay, you might feel a little bit more powerful and explosive in your performance, or not even that. Sorry, you gotta go, buddy. Not even that, but you're
Like repeat spreadability,
I,
you're gonna have more reps
yeah,
on that.
you'll just, yeah. So you won't be able to sustain that for a long period of time, I guess is what I'm saying. But it's good to know when to switch back and forth and from parasympathetic to sympathetic. It's something that I realized yesterday actually watching the Lakers game is LeBron. There was like an argument and they're arguing for the refs or whatever, and all the players were arguing, yelling at each other. Their balls were getting thrown. They were smacking the ball out of each other's hands. And then you saw LeBron James on the side of the court, on the opposite side of the court, sitting there, just breathing and just sitting there, upright, just straight, just watching. And I know that he has been working a lot on his mental health, his meditation, his the kind of mindset aspect of it, which is something that's going to switch him into a more parasympathetic state, which is good for his sustainable efforts, his repeatability of his efforts. So I think there's
And
something to that, definitely.
yeah, so it's not to say that if I'm bench pressing and I'm at 90% of my 1 rep max, that my heart rate won't get jacked up during the bench press, but maybe I'm still breathing through my nose. Why is that? It's because the heart rate isn't the best indicator of what type of state you're in. So you could be on the court and he can go dunk on somebody, grab 100 rebounds, always be breathing through his nose. But during those acute bouts of high intensity, that ATP PCR, he's in ATP PCR. He's not in glycolysis primarily. So he's still staying relatively alactic or below his lactate threshold when he's playing for the most part. That's why he has such a sustained effort throughout the game.
Yeah, and that ability to switch comes with practice. And one thing that is like a simple, like the most basic protocol method that Brian McKenzie uses is it's a 1-2-1 breathing pattern. So the ratio is 1-2-1. So let's say you breathe, you can inhale for 5 seconds, then you would exhale for 10 seconds, hold for 5 seconds, and repeat. And that's just a way to get you into that parasympathetic state. So it's a way to kind of that's a down regulating sequence of breath that you can practice to help get to that parasympathetic shift.
If you understand the physiology, you'll know when to use different types of breaths. So if you really want to recover, what do you think you should do? If you went really hard, still went nasal breathing, after you want to shift to a parasympathetic state like the gazelle or the lion right after, what do? You would want to breathe in and do breath holds with your air in. And why is that? The amount of perfusion that you're going to have with that oxygen, you're going to get a lot of CO2 out. So that's the recovery aspect of it. And that's what he recommends too, is to do like a ratio of one inhalation, 5, 1, 5 hold, 4 exhalation, or 2 exhalation. Sorry. You're getting a lot of air in, and you're holding it there to try and rid CO2 of the system. And that is your optimization aspect. So there's a lot that goes into it.
Yeah, I just realized I said that wrong. I said 1-2-1 in, out, hold. It's in, hold, out. Yeah, so it's breathe in for 1, hold for 2, and then breathe out for 1. Yeah. But yeah, so I mean, there's a bunch of different ways you can kind of learn different techniques and that to help with this. But I think understanding the physiology behind it will definitely benefit you the most. But is there anything else you'd like to say?
Nope.
All right.
That's it.
All right. Well, adios, muchachos.